on the program. And you can follow me everywhere on social media at Keaton D. Nichols. Just want to welcome everyone into the podcast, everyone who's listening to us live. I appreciate you all for tuning in. Tonight, we're actually in a number of places tonight. So we're expanding the Nichols Worth network, if you will. We're broadcasting live right now on YouTube. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're also on Twitter as well. So just make sure you follow me at Keaton D. Nichols on all those social spaces as well. That way you can get everything all involved in one. So shout out to Periscope helping us broadcast on Twitter, and Restream that's helping us rebroadcast everywhere as well. And of course, as always, I would encourage folks that are listening, if you're new to this process, of course, we want you to participate in this conversation as much as possible. So if you have something to say, something to add to the conversation, or if you just want to say hello or want to ask a question, please feel free to do that. You can do that right down there in the comment section. Let us know how you feel about the news that's happening today. That's what we cover here on A Nichols Worth. And the news today out of Atlanta, you might have heard the announcement of this. This is progress. This is big news. In my estimation, the Atlanta officers that were involved in the shooting death of Rayshard Brooks have been charged. Charges have been announced, against those two officers. An arrest warrant has been issued for a former Atlanta police officer who shot and killed Rayshard Brooks, a 27-year-old black man, in a Wendy's parking lot Friday. This, according to, of course, The Hill. Fulton County District Attorney Paul Howard Jr. said in a press conference Wednesday afternoon that Garrett Rolfe, also 27 years old. That's something interesting that I hadn't really thought about before this, but both of these men were 27 years old engaged in this. They're both millennials. Just interesting. Anyway, Garrett Rolfe has been charged with 11 criminal counts, the most serious being felony murder, which means he could have a possible sentence of life in prison without parole, or the death penalty, from what I understand here. An arrest warrant has also been issued. This is possibly the most interesting piece of what's going on here. An arrest warrant has also been issued for Devin Brosnan, the other officer on the scene. He's been charged with 3 criminal counts, the most serious being aggravated assault. So not just levying charges against the officer that actually fired the shots, but the officer that was also there with him, and who also kicked Rayshard Brooks whenever he was on the ground after he was shot. Also put a knee in his back once he was already shot and handcuffed. It's a weird situation, weird stuff that goes on with the cops there. Anyway, Howard had announced, Fulton County District Attorney Howard had announced that Brosnan would actually become a witness of the state of Georgia, an unprecedented move in the case. So in other words, Brosnan would be made to snitch against his own partner in this particular case. And how often do we see that in cases like this? Almost never. As a matter of fact, we kind of see the polar opposite reaction when it comes to police. We see usually whenever a police officer is involved in something like this, that the police actually the police that are around him actually band around and attempt to protect him from the attacks that come after an event like this. We're now seeing Officer Devin Brosnan, now being set to witness against his partner. Just one of the things that is somewhat unprecedented about what we've seen here in Atlanta as a result of this. Now, the big question is always, what is the impact of this? Like, how is this going to take effect moving down the line? It's not the first time that we've even seen, with any sort of swiftness, an officer arrested and charged pretty quickly after an incident like this with homicide or with felony murder in this particular case, as was the case with Garrett Rolfe. So what are we supposed to process with this information? How does this differ in a sense from other situations that we've seen? The first thing that immediately came to my mind, of course, was the situation involving the shooting of Walter Scott. You might remember him in North Charleston, South Carolina. Walter Scott was pulled over, I believe, for a taillight that was out in his car. That ended up with, of course, him losing his life. Walter Scott was shot in the back multiple times by Officer Michael Slager after he ran away. And what made that situation even more interesting, Michael Slager did not know that he was being filmed. He didn't know. There was no body camera that was activated on him. It was a bystander that so happened to catch the interaction. But Michael Slager initially, tried to say that Walter Scott took his taser, just like what we saw over the weekend, right? Took his taser and attempted to shoot him with the taser before running off. What we saw on the video, however, was former Officer Michael Slager actually picking up his taser and walking it over to the then dead body of Walter Scott and placing it next to him. It's all on camera, right? Obviously, he apologized for that and realizing that he was in error, but he was also sentenced to 20 years in prison. Not necessarily directly for the murder of Walter Scott, which a lot of people felt that's what he should be serving time for, but essentially for depriving Scott of his civil rights, among some other things. So it's not the first time that we've seen an officer very swiftly taken into custody or very swiftly charged. Just a couple of weeks ago, it took 5 days, but you got all four Minneapolis police officers that were involved in George Floyd's death to be charged. That sort of might seem like a big win in this particular case, but we've still got a long way to go from here. We still don't kind of have a good perception as to what's going to happen from here, because we've seen all different types of things happen from here. And the kind of backdrop that we have means that these charges don't exactly equal change right away. But, I can say that this situation certainly does at least start to open up the book for how we can maybe start to think about punishments for these officers. And we very much so are entrenched in a system where the motivation to change your behavior is very much so steeped in what kind of punishment you might face if indeed you engage in that action. It's hard to change a culture, right? Like it's hard to say, look, you need to look at everything, not just your actions, direct and indirect actions towards Black people, but you need to look at the way that you live your life, the things that you think about, the considerations that you have for the people around you. It's a difficult task. It requires time. It requires self-reflection, meditation, a lot. And I think until that point, what we've been pushing for is that, look, some action needs to be taken right now. The systemic changes that I talk about oftentimes on this program, or that we might talk about as a community, these things are going to take some time. But in the meantime, this situation that we've seen in Atlanta, the situation that we've seen in Minneapolis, they needed to be addressed quickly, and they were. And that might seem like progress until you start to think, until you really start to back up and say, wait a minute. How is this impacting other police departments? We still have not arrested the police officers who shot and killed Breonna Taylor. They shot her 8 times while she was sleeping. We haven't gotten there yet. What does that fight look like? And why should it be a fight? That can't be, right? We can't expend all of this energy just to get a set of just to get charges that should be happening anyway. We can't keep expelling this much energy into trying to in some way, shape, or form make the system work as it's supposed to work. What we saw in Atlanta wasn't today wasn't an exception to the rule and an exception to the system. That's how the system should work. Should work. Of course. And it's just so hard. It's an uphill battle when you think that something that should have happened took this much effort and this much response in a moment where the world is basically stopped because of coronavirus. This much effort for this. I don't know what the charges or how long either of these cops will serve in prison, if they are even charged. By the time we get to that process, or that time in the process, we could be in a different environment here in the United States. Maybe there won't be as much focus on the protests or the protesters. Maybe the killing of African Americans by police and other people that think that they're police, maybe it won't be the headline story by the time we get around to the sentencing and the charging and all that other stuff, because that's still a very real possibility. We're in a country right now where we are forcing the reopen or forcing to reopen the economy in certain states where there are actually cases of COVID-19 going up. Hospitalizations are going up. You've got people signing a waiver to attend a presidential rally there in Tulsa, Oklahoma, knowing that they could be infected with said virus. But they're doing it anyway. That's what kind of country that we're in right now. I mean, I think that this says a lot about this moment. What we saw in Atlanta today and what we heard from Atlanta today in these charges that were levied against these officers is very much so a reaction to what we have seen. But I think that is in effect the problem. This is not the first time that a man has been shot in the back. And I'm not just talking about Walter Scott. This is not the first time, probably even in Atlanta, that a man has been shot in the back running away from police, or a black person in general has been shot unnecessarily or killed unnecessarily by police. And I think when we look at the backdrop of what's happening right now, it is incredible. It is this incredibly unique time where everyone is sort of stopped and paying attention to what's going on. But I'm just not fooled, if you will. I'm not pulled into thinking that progress is truly being made when it seems politically convenient to do so. How politically convenient is this moment right now in time? For anybody that follows politics a little bit, even if you don't, follow along with me here for just a second, right? You've got one black Republican senator, rather, in the Senate. The Democrats, by the way, have a grand total of 2, so they're not doing too much better. But one black senator who's being tasked right now with creating the Republican response, the federal Republican legislative response to what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. A bill that would effectively hold police accountable for some of the actions that we've seen taking place on video in the last couple of weeks. The GOP Senate unveiled this bill today, as a matter of fact, but according to NPR, the Democrats say the proposal, which would encourage, not require, but encourage police departments to end such practices such as chokeholds and no-knock warrants, but does not explicitly ban them, falls short of some of the objectives of these protesters of what we've seen. Chuck Schumer, who's basically like the number 2 Democrat around in the Senate, he says there's no reason to scribble our changes in the margins or nibble around the edges of this large, difficult, and persistent problem. The moment calls for bold action, and the American people are behind it. That last part, the moment calls for bold action, and the American people are behind it. It has become politically advantageous at this point to effectively say that Black Lives Matter. There is still obviously much silly debate on this issue that goes on as if it is a debate. But at this point, what we understand now is that it is politically advantageous to say and to express in some way, shape, or form that Black Lives Matter. Politically advantageous. That's something to make progress on. That is something that is a better outlook. It creates rather a better outlook on this scenario than what we've seen in the past when, let's say, folks like this, like the Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, weren't exactly so gung-ho about addressing these sort of issues. Maybe speaking to them, having thoughts and prayers, et cetera, right? But actually taking action, it wasn't politically advantageous for them to do so. Black men and women didn't just start getting killed by police a couple of months ago or a couple of weeks ago. That's how politically advantageous it is to support the idea of Black Lives Mattering, that even in the Republican-held Senate, you've got them trying to create a bill, although it's a toothless bill, but trying to create a bill that says, look, we did something to address this issue that everyone is talking about at this point. I mean, everyone is talking about it. We can't be fooled by these kind of things politically. I've said that, time and time again, that, we do need to have a more serious conversation about what our political engagement or what our political energy is really going to. When we cast votes, of course, that's just one small part of our civic engagement. But what does that mean to support a political party when the political parties at this point seem to be dancing around what is a very serious and very real issue to us? This is not a politically timely thing for Black people. This is not something that we just, We ought to get all of our ducks in a row because Black lives matter now more than they have in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years or 100 years. This is not a political football that we can kick around. This is real life for a lot of us. And I think us addressing, some of our representatives and some of the more systemic ways to bring about change sort of exposes this idea that when it becomes politically advantageous, perhaps we will see some of the changes that we've needed in this country for a long time. What is broken about our system? The idea that Black lives can matter only when it becomes politically advantageous to do so, when you look good doing so. We saw this in the NFL certainly too, and we're hearing that with the conversation around Colin Kaepernick this week. Should Colin Kaepernick be playing, or who should sign him? Even the Donald Trump, who happens to be president of the United States, is, in a backhanded sort of way, endorsing the idea of Colin Kaepernick playing in the NFL. This is the same guy that just a few years ago called the players that are kneeling SOBs. The same guy, right? But it's so politically advantageous to say this. This is what we have, even in the NFL. And the NFL is sort of a microcosm for a lot of American companies that I believe are kind of reacting in this same sort of way. This is not, for I think a lot of people and for a lot of institutions, this moment is not about coming to the realization that you have been wrong all along. That's what I think a lot of these institutions would like you to perceive their stance is on this now. Look, we have looked at the situation in front of us, and we found out that we've been messing up for a long time. We've been endorsing the wrong ideas for a long time, and that needs to change now. Well, you don't just get to hit the reset button. You don't just get to move on as if nothing happened. Continually, as I read stories like this, and I hear about these institutions that are ready to make this change now, the more and more I keep coming back to the realization that reparations are necessary here. It's just not enough to say that we're willing to make these changes right now within this moment. It's not. And I think the more that we understand the urgency behind this kind of moment, the quicker that we get behind this idea that systemic change is necessary in this situation, because this is not something that just lasts over the next couple of months or the next couple of weeks. This has to last for life. These are the things that we think about for life, and our involvement in that will sort of make more sense. Where we settle in, or where we fit in to how we make that change, makes more sense. If you feel like you're not doing enough, or you haven't been able to do enough to affect change in this moment, I would ask yourself, or I would sit down with yourself and figure out, what is my involvement? What has my contribution been to the world before? What exactly have I been doing, and what ideas have I been pushing and promoting before? And how can I then be a different person from this point forward? Yes, I need to be able to make those changes. But also, what have I done in the past that I need to make up for, in effect? I can't just say I'm changed and that's it. It's not real. It's not real to me. It doesn't feel real to me. And it's not going to feel real to future generations that have to deal with this kind of thing as well. I'm excited, if that's even a term, or if I can even say that the charges against this Atlanta police officer came as quickly as they did. 5 days is still a long time. This happened Friday night, right? Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That's 5 days. It's the same amount of time that it took for those Minneapolis police officers to be charged as well. I consider this to be progress, and I want to be positive about this kind of thing. But again, I'm reminded that this is just this particular case, and that this system will always bring us this sort of abbreviated version of justice, if you will. There's nothing that's going to bring back the life of Rayshard Brooks. And so, by technical definition, is there anything that can be done to Garrett Wolfe or anyone else who was involved in this incident that will make good on what happened to Rayshard Brooks? No. And that's why the changes that we implement cannot constantly be shrouded in this idea that punishment will amend the culture of the behavior of what we've seen, not just with police, but in America in general, and their viewpoints on Black Americans and the value of Black Americans in this instance. We cannot rely upon the system to autocorrect itself, and we can't rely upon the system to define for us what that freedom truly looks like. We can't. We got to keep our eyes and our minds sort of focused on the change that we want to see, not an abbreviated version of it, not a pacifier to keep us quiet for the moment. And just another reminder that the officers who killed Breonna Taylor, that's just one case that we know about, still haven't been arrested at this point. So for me to say that this represents the kind of progress that I can and the change that I can believe in moving forward would be false. But I do think that this is a good first step to at least starting to set an example. Starting to set an example of what should happen all the time, minus the protests, minus us pouring all this energy into ensuring that institutions that should have a high moral character actually live up to that high moral character. It's a lot of energy for us. I think a lot of us have lives to live. A lot of us want to live fuller lives and to do things that we enjoy, not constantly be embroiled into this sort of fight that we have to engage in just to sometimes get these very simple aspects of justice. So it's a good start. What's happening in Atlanta is a good start. But it's absolutely not the end of what we need to keep pressing for, which is systemic change. And by the way, Colin Kaepernick needs to be signed in the NFL. I thought about this real quick before I get to the comments and stuff. I thought about this with Kaepernick and what it would sort of mean for Colin Kaepernick to return to the NFL, because let's not forget, it's been 3 years that he's been unsigned in the NFL. He actually won his legal fight against the NFL that basically argued that the NFL owners had colluded to keep him out of the league. He won that settlement. We don't know how much money he won, but we do know that the NFL paid up. And so a lot of people say, look, that's the end of Colin Kaepernick's playing career. He's never going to play in the NFL again. But obviously he expressed still an interest in doing so, even staging a workout last year, the NFL staging a workout for Colin Kaepernick, which was proceeded by no teams deciding to take a chance on him, take a flyer. Colin Kaepernick is, I believe, 32 years old. There's a significant portion of starting and backup quarterbacks in the NFL that are 32 years or above. And keep in mind that the last couple of years, the last 3 seasons, Colin Kaepernick hasn't been beat up by big NFL players on the field. Someone should sign Colin Kaepernick. I would still be satisfied with that result, but it would still be kind of weird, in essence, to see that there's a league that in the NFL, rather, that they would be welcoming Kaepernick back with open arms at this point. What would that say of the last couple of years and the decisions that GMs made? There were GMs and team owners that lost games, that lost season potential, that lost playoff chances because they did not sign Colin Kaepernick. They didn't have a quarterback on their team, a capable one at least. I mean, what does that say that you're willing to sign him now when it's, again, politically advantageous? What does that really say about your GMing skills for the last couple of years? What does that say about the league and what kind of environment they're welcoming as well? That only after political pressure, only after those 12 players made that video, directly to Roger Goodell, then the change was implemented. I'm not convinced in any way, shape, or form, even if Colin Kaepernick is re-signed, that the NFL has in some way, shape, or form turned over a new leaf. But much like the story we discussed before with police officers being charged in these cases, it's like a good initial first step. It's like a first step into the opening conversation about how we make change. And I think that that's at least the first thing that needs to happen. And whether or not Roger Goodell, the commissioner of the NFL, is going to directly apologize, I wouldn't exactly hold my breath on something like that. But we shall definitely see how that kind of thing turns out. Let me get to some of these comments as well. We do have a few comments, and thank you, people. Thank you, everyone, rather, for joining me here on the stream. Everyone can, of course, follow me on social media at Keaton D. Nichols. And you can also, of course, tune in live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We do the show here on Facebook and now on a number of other places as well: Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, all of that. So make sure you follow me for more. Let's get to some of these comments. Robert Peterson comments in on the Facebook page. He says, I agree. Look at the decision from the Supreme Court about police immunity. This will be read by many as no need for radical change. I'm very careful about analyzing the sort of the moves that are made at a federal level. Let's not forget back in 2013, just, a slight pivot, but still, the same related issue, that there were major provisions of the Voting Rights Act that were removed. The federal oversight provisions basically were removed from the Voting Rights Act, meaning that the voting districts that previously had a history of, suppressing the African American vote in this country would no longer have to address the federal government before changing their rules, possibly purging voter rolls, or, and in many different ways you can suppress the black vote. But this federal oversight was no longer there after 2013. That was under Obama too, by the way. So when things become politically advantageous, these moves are not as surprising to me. Like when I see the Senate, drumming up these bills, Democrats, Republicans, either side, they're drumming up these bills and this legislation to make change at a federal level. That's not surprising to me. It's hip now to say that Black Lives Matter. You don't have to actually mean it, but it's certainly hip to at least say it and to profess it. But this change doesn't mean anything to me. I think if it did mean something to these representatives, they would have done it long before this moment. And so it's too late to kind of go back on this idea, or to go back to this idea that it suddenly now means something simply because it's being proposed in this moment. I don't read too deeply into that at all. And when it comes to systemic systemic representative change, I should say, that's what we're trying to ultimately push out. Representatives that don't exactly see the representation that they need to have for a lot of the constituents. Seems simple enough for me. Robert Peterson comments back and he says, yeah, the Steelers might have been in the playoffs. Pittsburgh was ratchet to Kaepernick too. I do think that the Steelers are one of those things. I don't want to get in like a super sports breakdown on this particular show. We can get back around that to on another show. But you're absolutely right. Steelers are one of these teams. The Jets. I can go on and on. Miami. There were so many teams, but I think something that sort of becomes jacked up, or that became jacked up about the Colin Kaepernick conversation in the past couple of years, is that anytime we ever did inch to this point where we said, what about Kaepernick in this situation? I know what that means politically. Again, it was not politically advantageous to do so in the last couple of years, but I know it's not the greatest thing politically to do. But what about Kaepernick from a skills perspective? He could really help a team win. What grew out of that argument was very ugly, and it basically said, well, what if, we don't even know if Colin Kaepernick is good enough to play in the NFL right now, which was a straw argument, right? Like anyone that watches the NFL, anyone that knows two things about football can see very much so that Colin Kaepernick is much, 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 much better than the NFL's worst of the last 3 years. And so the conversation about where he should have gone, suddenly just kind of became this fodder for a lot of sports organizations, sports media and things like that, to sort of discuss as a sidebar, as an intriguing conversation that they might be able to broadcast to some of their fans. But it wasn't a real conversation about what it would take to get Colin Kaepernick back in the league. And we are seeing a little bit about what it would take to get Kaepernick back in the league right now. And it's going to take some sort of acknowledgement, direct acknowledgement from the NFL that what happened with Colin Kaepernick was A, intentional, and B, it was wrong. Those are two big steps. At this point, no matter what happens, you're going to need those steps to be implemented for Colin Kaepernick to successfully return to the NFL. And is the NFL in that position? It's certainly politically advantageous for them to do so. It doesn't mean that they're going to. But I would say at the very least, that's going to be something that's necessary for us to kind of move forward on this situation. For me to feel good about watching the NFL again, I haven't felt good about watching the NFL in the last 3 years. And I'll admit that I've still watched it for the most part. I just can't feel good. And seeing even players in the wake of what happened with Colin Kaepernick, seeing them be punished or reprimanded by team owners for things that they're doing in honor of what Colin Kaepernick first started, I think is even more incredible. And so dancing around this the last 3 years has been uncomfortable as a black NFL fan, I got to say. And it's going to continue to be uncomfortable until they do right by Kaepernick, as many people have mentioned before. Appreciate the comment, Robert. My homie Gina comments in. I appreciate you listening, Gina. She says, changes at a federal level would be great, but I'm admittedly not optimistic at all about that. I think people should also keep in mind that states can pass legislation and make a difference. And in some ways, state governments are easier for people to understand and access to because it's a closer level of government. It also isn't federal prosecutors who are making charging decisions in those cases. It's state prosecutors. So I think a great deal of power can come from from individual states taking action. And I concur with that. I think at the state level, it is much simpler, I think, to implement and institute these kinds of changes. I think, as I mentioned with that 2013 statutes that were removed from the Voting Rights Act, I think that was a time when we kind of looked at the role of the federal government to protect what was happening with us on a local scale. I think that's one of those things that we can look at and say, well, we shouldn't really rely upon that system too heavily. And so I think a part of redefining what this society really looks like as well is redefining what our representation looks like at a federal level. I mean, do we really know? This is a question that we all can ask ourselves, but do we really know what the role of Pennsylvania's, like if you live in a lot of us who are listening to this now live in Pennsylvania, but whatever state that you're in, do you know the role of your federal legislators, your federal representatives, right? The congressmen and the two senators that are in your state? Do you understand what the role of what their role in your life is and in your political life? I don't think a lot of us do, and I don't think that those representatives do a great job necessarily at sort of understanding what their role is either towards the people. They're missing a lot there. But to your point, Gina, I think at a state level and at a local level, these are much more impactable, let's say, representatives. And I think, the more local that these issues are sort of addressed, the more that we see us as young people, especially, we can insert ourselves into these conversations and into these positions as well whenever we see some shortcomings. That's something that I think we need to be making a regular part of our culture as well. Being that change. Like, I'm certainly over the point of begging and asking representation to do a better job. If I employ these people, I basically pay these people with my taxes, then I'm just not going to keep you employed. That seems simple enough for me. So that has to be a part of our realized power in this situation. That especially at a local level, to your point, like I said, Gina, at a local level, we have a lot of influence. And if we don't like the kind of influence that's being thrown around, then we have a say in that as well. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to take advantage of that power as well. Most certainly. Thank you for the question, Gina. I appreciate it. Selena comments in and says, all because he kneeled. And that is, really talking about Kaepernick and the wave that was sort of affected by this. I think it's because he kneeled, but it was also this sort of the representation of what he was kneeling for. I think in the NFL, it's so easy, especially when sports just in general, but keeping this focused on the NFL, when the NFL is still pumping, it's a 365 day a year kind of sport. Even in the off season, there's a tremendous amount of intrigue around what's happening in the NFL. And I think a part of it wasn't just the kneeling that people were upset about. It was the idea that sports fans that soak in so much football as a part of their daily lives, there's so much sports. These sports fans were forced to think of these athletes as something other than what they see between the lines or on the gridiron. And that was uncomfortable for a lot of sports fans. I don't know if folks have spent a tremendous amount of time around sports media or the culture of sports media, but this is one of my great passions in life, is to change the narrative on what sports media should be and what sports media should be defined as, because a lot of it is very whitewashed. When we go to these networks, when we patronize these networks, we're listening to analysts oftentimes that are focused on the idea that so long as these athletes are just playing the game and they're doing nothing else, so long as they're shutting up and dribbling, so to speak, then our jobs are pretty easy. It's easy for us to define these athletes and analyze what's going on. But as soon as Colin Kaepernick knelt, I think that introduced the idea that these players are much more than just players, that they have lives outside of this, and that guess what? Even though maybe the common person and these football players might be on a different salary range, that these football players and these basketball players who look like you and me have to deal with this very harsh reality that they could be killed, they could be arrested unfairly, they could be, hurt or injured by the police just as easily as we can. I mean, that's a heavy reality for a sports meathead to get used to. Your average sports meathead that just wants to talk about stats and that just wants to talk about championships and greatness on the field. What Kaepernick, it wasn't just a thing where people were trying to take the stance on the flag and all that. That was just it was a proxy sort of war on what was really going on here. I think what Kaepernick did made a lot of sports fans uncomfortable. And having those conversations now about putting Colin Kaepernick back in the league means that they have to acknowledge that they were made so uncomfortable that they would have rather had Colin Kaepernick not a part of the conversation at all than to consider that these players are more than just players on the field. That's what this stand really means. That's what the stand really represents. Colin Kaepernick, I think, just wants to play football. I know there's a lot of people that are like, look, man, he represents a symbol for change and he has revolutionized so many things. But I think at the end of the day, he wants to play football. I do. And that's not a crime. Most certainly, that's not a crime. It's not a crime to want to play football, to be on the biggest stage for wanting to play football, and to also express that I am a human being through and through, and that I'm affected by issues that have nothing to do with football. But that doesn't necessarily mean that me as a football player have to separate that from my very existence. I was just talking to somebody today about, the sort of the mental fortitude that goes into being black when you step out every single day, that you realize a lot of these issues, they're issues that should be on the forefront of our minds, but we must internalize them in one way, shape, or form, just so that we can go to work or just so that we can live some sort of sense of normal lives. Sometimes we just got to internalize this stuff and just suck it up. And Colin Kaepernick was somebody who said, I'm not going to suck it up. If this costs me everything, I don't know if he was necessarily thinking about that, but he basically said, look, if this costs me everything, then it's worth it. It's worth the message that I'm trying to convey here to people. And how many of us have that same attitude about us? How many of us are willing to say, look, if it came down to my job or standing up for what's right, how many of us are willing to take the latter? How many of us are financially stable enough to be able to do? Because we know that Kaepernick maybe was, but a lot of us aren't. And so it will take some sort of sacrifice, I think, on a massive scale. Not just, white people and people outside the black community that don't understand the value of black lives. But as I mentioned, I think in my last episode, there's going to have to be some sacrifice on our part too. As African Americans in this situation, there's going to have to be some sacrifice. We're gonna have to say to ourselves, tough decisions are going to have to be made, but this is more important. We're coming back around to this idea that, because it's politically advantageous to, that the whole country is coming around to the idea that Colin Kaepernick was right. Black lives do matter, and we do need to be taking action right now. Even if it doesn't look like you're on the winning side, even if you're not the most popular one, or your decision, rather, is not the most popular one that you've made, stand by what you feel is right. That's been something that I feel like a lot of people have had trouble doing, But I appreciate the comments, Lena, most certainly. Um, let's see. Did we get another comment in here? On the Instagram, we got a comment. Wahida says, I don't know how much longer I have to keep progressing into more and more permanent complacency, referring back to what we were talking about with incremental changes that are being implemented now as a result of some of the protests that we've seen. We saw it in Atlanta, just for those that are maybe joining us a little bit late, of course. The 2 officers have been charged. The more serious charges going to the officer, obviously, that shot Rashard Brooks, in the back. And, is this change? Is this progress in a sense? And I'm with you on this, Wahida. It's hard for me to see this as progress. Because we've seen this situation before. After 2017, when Michael Slager was prosecuted for shooting Walter Scott, that didn't change the culture of police in America. It didn't. Police were still shooting black and brown people in this country unnecessarily. And it became just a thing of the moment. We were so happy when Michael Slager was charged, when the North Charleston Police Department did the right thing. As a matter of fact, that was a situation where the family of Walter Scott actually forgave Michael Slager very publicly for what he did, and saying that they had some form of compassion and sympathy for the Slager family because they're also going through a tough time. That was controversial for a lot of people. But that kind of process, when the process is responsible for instituting justice on people like this, we've known that it is tremendously underwhelmed in that category. I appreciate the comment, Wahida, checking in on the Instagram page. Robert Peterson, one more time, he comments in. He says, some devout fans want to glorify, not humanize the players. I noticed a lot of people, in the last couple of years that were willing to say and highlight what a great sacrifice that Colin Kaepernick sort of made in this instance. However, they weren't willing to support the notion that Colin Kaepernick ought to be playing in the NFL right now. We'd love to, sort of put players on this pedestal after the damage has been done. And that was one of the things that I've felt so uncomfortable about watching football in the last couple of years, was the idea that you're wasting, good years of a man's prime in the NFL simply for these, sort of semantics that don't seem to, be advantageous for you at the time. Those teams knew that taking on Colin Kaepernick might mean a hit to their wallets. Might mean, by the way, a hit to their wallets. Right now, however, I think a lot of team owners are looking financially at that situation as being different, which is why we're seeing this conversation about Kaepernick sort of arising again at this particular time. Do not be fooled by incremental change, or do not be fooled into thinking that incremental change is enough to keep us satisfied for this moment. That ain't it. Not in this moment. We got to keep fighting. Got to keep fighting. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on the show. Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 8 p.m. right here on Facebook, Instagram. We're on Twitter now, YouTube, all different types of places as well. You can follow me at Keaton D. Nichols. That's me personally. You can follow at Keaton D. Nichols. If you want to follow the show, and you should, just a personal suggestion, you should go on Facebook, on YouTube. You can follow, you can follow at A. Nichols Worth. If you search that in the search box, A. Nichols Worth, or YouTube, you can do the same thing, searching A. Nichols Worth. A good way to stay connected. By the way, I know I kind of posted this movie on my Instagram and Facebook yesterday. For those listening to the audio version, I'm holding up a cover for the movie Chicken Run. I saw this with my mom yesterday, and for the first time in years. I used to watch it all the time as a kid. And there are some really deep metaphors in this movie to Black liberation in America. And so a couple of people jumped into the inbox and said, hey, look, man, don't joke around about that podcast. Do the podcast on Chicken Run. So I'm doing the podcast on Chicken Run. All right, so make sure you guys are tuned into that. That'll be available on some of our channels, as I mentioned, Facebook, Twitter. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Keaton D. Nichols, YouTube, Anchor. We're on Spotify as well. Make sure you follow, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we'll see you again on Friday live at 8 o'clock for a fresh edition of A Nichols Worth. Until then, I will see everybody on the flip side.